The air beneath the hive does not move. It hangs heavy, thick with fumes that bite the throat and sting the eyes. Rust grinds against rust as the machines cough through their endless cycles. A broken rhythm echoing across chambers where men and women no longer breathe freely but measure each gasp like coin. Down here, faith is not chosen, is rationed. Hope comes not from sermons, but from the faint hum of systems that no one remembers how to repair. Yet within the suffocating dark, stories spread like sparks, and each spark threatens to ignite. Some whisper that what suffocates them is not only the weight of industry, but something older, something buried within the foundations. In this place where every shadow seems to listen, survival itself becomes a liturgy. That is where our story begins. If these hidden histories speak to you, if you want to see deeper into the shadows that the Imperium itself dares not name, then stay with us. Subscribe, share, and help carry the light further into the Hive's forgotten depths. Each voice matters here, and together we can keep the echoes alive. The first thing Kael'Varn noticed each morning was not the sound of the machinery, but the way the ash drifted against gravity. He would open his eyes to the groan of pipes and the scrape of cogitator fans, and still, before he could move, his gaze would trace the ceiling. There it hung, a black veil, caught in unseen currents, swaying above like a reminder that even nature itself had been broken here. In Hive Nexarus, the ash fell upward, clinging to the rafters and ducts, as if the hive exhaled in reverse. No one questioned it anymore. They only learned to live beneath a sky of soot that never settled. Kael's lungs had long since surrendered to the taste. Every breath carried rust, iron, and a faint tang of oil. He counted those breaths like coin, not from superstition, but necessity. His respirator was patched more times than he could remember, its Vox grill held together by wire and memory. He marked oxygen cycles on a scrap of flaking parchment, hidden beneath his bunk, not because he feared running out, but because numbers were the only thing that gave him shape in a world where time dissolved into smoke. His duty was simple, though never light. As a servitor technician, he walked the lower manufactorum levels, listening to the dying pulse of machines that had not been serviced properly in decades. Whole swaths of the hive had been abandoned to malfunction, left to churn and grind themselves into ruin. Kael's task was not to fix, not to repair, but to keep the rhythm steady enough that collapse never came all at once. He patched with scraps, welded with spit and hope, and prayed that the humming pipes would hold another week. He prayed, but not to the Emperor. He prayed to silence. Silence meant stability. Silence meant the hive had not yet noticed its own decay. The people around him accepted their lives with a kind of numb devotion. Ration lines formed under vox horns that blared decrees like sermons. Men bowed their heads, not from reverence, but from exhaustion. The administratum's words echoed until even hunger felt like liturgy. Children licked rust from their fingers and learned to call it holy. When Kael passed through the dormitories, he saw faces streaked not with hope but with soot, and eyes that did not ask why the ceilings bled ash. They only asked if the pipes would hold. At night, Kael could hear the whispers. The walls carried them, passed from dorm to dorm, corridor to corridor. They spread faster than air, faster than fire. Whispers that the ash was not ash at all, but the breath of something buried deeper than any manufactorum. Whispers that the hive itself was alive, exhaling in patterns that bent the laws of nature. He tried to ignore them. He told himself that superstition was the only fuel left when hunger hollowed the bones. Yet even he felt the weight of unseen eyes when he walked alone, tools jangling at his side. On the 93rd oxygen cycle of the year, Kael's tally marks were interrupted. A power conduit ruptured on level 17, blasting molten copper across the wall and sending a cascade of sparks into the air. The ash above shivered, stirred, as if in pain, and for a moment, Kael swore it reached down, lowering toward the workers in a slow, writhing curtain. Men screamed and scattered, not from the fire, but from the movement above them. The sparks hissed out, the conduit sealed itself with a dying groan, and still the ash did not return to its place. It lingered closer, as though watching. That night, the whispers grew louder. He lay in his bunk, respirator hissing, counting the faint tick of pipes through the walls. The men around him muttered prayers, not the litany of the ecclesiarchy, but broken syllables older than Imperial tongue, words that had no meaning in records, only in memory. When he asked an elder where the words came from, the man only smiled with blackened teeth and said, "From before." Cale did not press further. Sleep came in fragments. He dreamed of corridors filled not with workers, but with shadows, each one shaped like a man, but hollow within. He dreamed of ceilings that cracked open to reveal not sky, but an endless mouth exhaling soot. When he woke, his parchment of oxygen cycles was gone. In its place, etched into the rust of his bunk frame, was a single marca tally he did not draw. The days that followed carried the same rhythm, but sharper edges. Rations grew thin, and the voxhorns began to falter, voices stuttering mid-sermon as if uncertain of their own words. Cale tried to steady himself with numbers, counting bolts, cycles, and breaths. But the numbers slipped, refusing to align. His parchment was gone, and though he began a new one, each mark he drew felt wrong, as if he were recording someone else's air. On the 99th cycle, the ash finally touched the ground. It came not in a fall, but in a slow descent, strands of black dust coiling downward like fingers. Men and women froze where they stood, heads tilted back, waiting as the hive itself seemed to breathe through them. Cale lifted a hand, palm out, and one of the strands landed against his skin. It burned cold, leaving a mark like ink that did not fade. Around him, the whispers ceased. No one spoke. No one prayed. For the first time, silence was absolute. Cale did not know if the hive had broken or if it had awakened. All he knew was that his breath no longer felt like his own. Each inhale tasted of iron and smoke, but beneath it was another flavor, something sharp, something old. He rubbed at the mark on his palm until it bled, yet the black line remained, and when he returned to his bunk, there were no men left. Only the sound of respirators, each one hissing in perfect unison, like a choir without bodies. He sat in the dark, tools heavy on his lap, listening to the rhythm of the hive. It no longer sounded like machines. It sounded like a heart too large to belong to any man, beating slow, steady, and deep beneath the manufactorum floors. Cale closed his eyes and counted the beats, not because he wanted to, because he had no choice. The ash no longer drifted upward. It waited above, coiled and patient, as if gravity itself had been rewritten to obey something unseen. Cale understood then that silence was not safety. Silence was listening, and the hive had been listening for far longer than he had been alive. He marked the new cycle in his mind, though no parchment remained, the first cycle of something else, something beginning beneath the soot. The taste of hunger was constant in hive nectar. It coated the mouth like rust, sharp and bitter, as though every breath drew iron filings across the tongue. Men spoke less, not because silence was safer, but because words wasted moisture. Even Cale Varn, whose respirator strained every breath through sputtering filters, could not escape the flavor. Metal lingered in everything, in the ration paste that oozed from broken dispensers, in the thin water that dripped from corroded pipes, even in the air itself. To live in the manufactorum levels was to swallow iron with each heartbeat. The administratum declared the scarcity a necessity. Decrees thundered through vox grills, each syllable flattened into a chant by the distortion of failing machines. Sacrifice sustains the Imperium. Starvation purifies the will. The words echoed not as orders, but as scripture. They rang across corridors until the people themselves began to repeat them, lips moving in time with the static-laced proclamations. In the ration lines, Cale watched mothers whisper the decrees into their children's ears as if they were lullabies. Starvation was not an absence anymore. It had become doctrine. The lines themselves were rituals. Men queued in silence, their ribs like scaffolds beneath cloth, their hands clutched tight to stamped tokens. Each ration was measured in spoonfuls of gray paste, thick with salt and faintly metallic. No one complained. To complain was to blaspheme. When the dispenser jammed, the crowd did not riot. They fell to their knees, eyes closed, waiting for the machine to yield what it would. Hunger had become holy. To eat was not a right but a blessing, and blessings could not be demanded. Cale remembered when food still carried taste. He could recall, dimly, the scent of bread, the chew of meat. Those memories belonged to another life, a life erased by ash and iron. Now, when he pressed the ration paste to his tongue, he forced himself to swallow, to accept that this was sustenance. Yet even he could not help but feel that each swallow carried more than salt. It carried a teaching, a shaping of the soul. The administratum had forged hunger into liturgy, and he was no more immune to its grip than the rest. One evening, as he worked on a collapsed vent shaft, Cale overheard a gathering of workers. They sat huddled in the dim glow of lumen strips, their bowls half empty, yet their eyes alight with fervor. An elder led them in a chant, not to the emperor, but to hunger itself. Each line was a devotion to absence. We are strong because we are empty. We endure because we are denied. The words chilled Cale. They carried rhythm, conviction, the kind of faith that could spread like fire. Days blurred into one another. Cale found himself counting meals instead of oxygen cycles, marking the hours by the scraping of spoons on metal bowls. The whispers through the hive shifted in tone. No longer were they simply rumors of ash or buried hearts. They became hymns of deprivation. Men spoke of visions seen in the edges of their hunger, of shapes moving through the soot when their stomachs growled loudest. They believed the hive rewarded the starved with glimpses of truth. Cale tried to dismiss it, tried to cling to his numbers, to the logic of cycles and repairs, but hunger gnawed deeper than logic. He began to dream of tables lined with endless bowls, each one filled with nothing but salt. In his dreams, he ate until his tongue blistered, yet still, he hungered. When he awoke, he found himself muttering fragments of the chants he had overheard. Words he had sworn he would never speak, now crawled from his mouth without his bidding. The ration lines grew longer as supply dwindled further. Dispensers sputtered, coughing out half portions before falling silent. The vox grills did not falter. Those sermons only grew louder. To starve is to serve. To wither is to be remade. Men collapsed in line, and those behind them stepped forward. Not with pity, but reverence, as though witnessing martyrs. Children gnawed at rust flakes chipped from pipes, their mouths bleeding, their mothers smiling faintly as if holiness had touched them. Cale watched one boy chew until his gums split, blood mixing with metal shavings. The child lifted his stained fingers toward the vox horn and whispered, "Thank you." The image branded itself into Cale's mind. He felt his own stomach hollowing, twisting not only with need, but with something darker and ache that was almost pride. To endure hunger was to be chosen. That was the lesson drilled into every ration, every breath, every line dot by the 105th oxygen cycle. Cale no longer marked his parchment with precision. His lines grew uneven, distracted by the gnawing in his gut. He found himself standing longer in the ration halls, listening as chants echoed against metal walls. He had once despised them, yet now they carried comfort, a rhythm that filled the emptiness inside. Each word struck like a hammer, shaping not only his hunger, but his will. The ash above seemed to thicken as the hunger deepened. It swirled more violently, its black coils descending lower, almost brushing the heads of those in line. People raised their hands toward it, lips cracked, eyes fever bright. They believed the ash itself was feeding them not with food, but with meaning. Cale did not join them, yet he did not walk away either. His eyes lingered on the ash, and in the hollow drum of his stomach. He felt something shift. That night, as he lay in his bunk, he could not sleep. The respirators around him hissed in their mechanical chorus, yet even their rhythm could not soothe him. He pressed his palm against his stomach, feeling the ache as if it were a voice. And in that ache, he thought he heard words. Not from vox grills, not from elders, but from the hunger itself. Words promising endurance, power, even revelation. He closed his eyes, but the voice lingered, threading through his veins with every throb of emptiness. Cale understood then that hunger was no longer absence. It had become presence. It was the law, the liturgy, the breath of the Hive itself. The people of Nexarus were not being starved. They were being taught. Each skipped meal was a lesson. Each pang of emptiness was a sermon. And slowly, he realized he had already begun to believe. The fragment of the Forge world had no name that mattered anymore. Its designation was long since stripped from records, its place on the star charts overwritten by more vital assets. What remained drifted in silence, a broken continent of iron and stone, suspended in void. Yet even abandoned, the fragment did not sleep. Its machine still sang, hymns of pistons and turbines echoing across hollowed decks. Each note a mechanical psalm that refused extinction. The liturgies of Mars had been built into its bones, and those bones refused to forget. A chapter had once been stationed here, meant only as wardens until reclamation or recall. Recall never came. Decades bled into centuries, and still, they held their vigil. The men trained each day as though the enemy might arrive at any hour, their drills as exact as any war. They sparred with bolters loaded, not with rounds but with prayer scrolls, their strikes marked not by blood but by scripture. They shouted litanies, with every swing, filling the air with thunder, until the sound itself became indistinguishable from battle. Maintenance became holy combat. Each rivet driven into metal was a strike against heresy. Each gear oiled was a wound healed in the body of the Omnissiah. They scrubbed grime from reactors with the fervor of purging corruption, and they walked the halls as if patrolling from. The line between duty and devotion blurred until there was no difference. For them, there was no waiting. There was only eternal war. Whether enemies stood before them or not, the fragment's forges still burned, though faintly. Great furnaces groaned, powered by dwindling reserves of promethium. The chapter treated every spark as a relic, every flame a sign that their vigil endured. Yet as centuries passed without foe, meaning began to corrode. Victories unearned festered in their memory. Warriors born for slaughter found only echoes to fight, and so they began to invent enemies. At first, the enemies were shadows. Men sparred against phantoms, imagining Xenos forms in the gloom of the Manufactoria. They painted crude silhouettes on walls, firing volleys at empty outlines. Later, the shadows became more vivid. Some swore they heard the shriek of orc war cries in the venting pipes, the mechanical rattle of Necron Gate in the echo of their boots. They raised alarms, rallied squads, and fought skirmishes in corridors already empty. Each victory was celebrated, hymns chanted, banners raised, yet no bodies fell, no foes bled, only their voices filled the silence. The silence did not break, it deepened. Where once their hymns were proud, they became desperate, rising higher and harsher, as though sheer volume might summon real enemies. Their chaplains declared that faith required trial, and if trial did not come, they must create it. The chapter turned upon itself. Squads clashed against squads in staged wars that never ended, each engagement escalating until blood finally flowed. Wounds were bound, warriors commended, but the hunger remained. They needed more than each other to fight. They needed meaning. In the depths of the fragment, the archives became their battlefield. Old records of campaigns long past were resurrected, but details blurred, enemies twisted. Battles fought against one foe became rewritten as wars against another. each retelling sharpened into myth. They sang hymns, not of victories earned, but of victories invented. The past itself became malleable, reshaped to suit their need for struggle. Kale, Varn's world of ash and hunger lay far away. But in this drifting forge world, deprivation took a different form, not of body, but of purpose. A chapter without war was a weapon without a target, and such a weapon will always find something to strike. They turned their rituals of maintenance into combat rites, their hymns into war cries, their archives into enemies. Slowly, they forgot that there had ever been a difference. Those who questioned the practice were silenced not by decree, but by pity. "Brother, you have forgotten the song," they would say, before drowning the doubter's voice in the roar of their chants. The doubters themselves eventually fell silent, not slain, but absorbed, chanting louder than all others to prove their loyalty. The fragment became a choir, endless and unbroken. Voices raised in hymns to wars that had never been fought, yet there were moments brief, fleeting when the silence of the void pressed in too heavily to ignore. When the hymn faltered, when the drums stilled, the warriors would look at each other with eyes that carried the weight of centuries, eyes that asked questions too dangerous to voice. Was there ever truly an enemy? Were they fighting shadows because shadows were all that remained? And if war never ended, if it was only ritual now, then what meaning had their vows to the Emperor? The chaplains answered with louder chants, with promises that the Emperor himself heard their hymns across the void, that each invented foe was a test, each imagined war a forge for their souls. And so the warriors screamed their doubts into song, drowning memory beneath sound. Their voices filled the fragment, echoing endlessly in steel corridors, until silence became the only true enemy. The fragment itself seemed to respond. The machines groaned louder, vents hissed like roaring beasts, and sparks from reactors painted the darkness with firelight. The chapter took these as signs, omens that their enemies were real. They pressed harder, chanting through bleeding throats, striking until their arms shook, inventing new battles with each cycle. They no longer cared if their foes were imagined. They only cared that the war never stopped. And so, the Forge World fragment drifted on, nameless and forgotten, yet not silent. Its songs carried faint across the void, intercepted rarely by astropaths who dismissed them as static or madness. Hymns of steel and ash, of battles unending, of victories hollow and fabricated. No distress calls, no requests for a Donley, the endless roar of a chapter that refused to die, even if it meant warring against memory itself. Somewhere within the fragment's endless hymns, truth had been lost, but truth was never their purpose. Their purpose was war, and if the galaxy had abandoned them, they would manufacture their own foes, their own history, their own meaning. They would not falter, because faltering meant silence, and silence was a death too final to endure. Thus the choir sang on, 1,000 voices merging with the roar of machines. Steel and ash fused into a liturgy without end. The fragment drifted unseen, yet it remained alive, pulsing with the rhythm of false wars. A chapter without enemy, without recall, without end, singing themselves into eternity. In the vaults beneath the Scholastica, there are corridors where light is rationed more carefully than breath. It is said that the lowest archives are not illuminated at all, for the words they contain are not meant to be read, but forgotten. Among those sealed vaults, in one index never officially opened, lies a story preserved only in fragments. A single phrase, spoken once, never repeated, never transcribed, yet carried across centuries like a wound that refuses to close. It is said that the phrase brought a Primarch to his knees. Which of the Emperor's sons it was, the records refuse to name. That silence is the first sign of its power. The account survives in scattered annotations, marginalia scratched into damaged data, and whispers muttered by archivists who claim to have touched the edges of the forbidden. The story begins not with the words themselves, but with the battlefield. A conquest among 1,000 others. Another world being brought into compliance beneath the banner of the Aquila. The Primarch named, unacknowledged, was at the heart of it. His legions spread across the plains, their bolters singing the Emperor's will. Victory was certain, the enemy broken. The banners of the Imperium already raised above the smoking ruins. And then, a voice. No record says whose voice it was. Some say it came from the mouth of a dying foe, a broken warrior whose final breath carried a curse. Others insist it was a child, hidden among the conquered, who spoke with eyes too ancient for their years. A few, in hushed tones, claim it was not a voice at all, but the battlefield itself, the earth groaning beneath the weight of conquest. Whatever its source, the phrase was heard. It was not a threat. It was not defiance. It was not prophecy, at least not in the language of prophecy. But whatever was spoken, it reached the ears of the Primarch, and for the first time in living memory, one of the Emperor's sons halted. He did not command. He did not strike. He did not rise in fury. He sank to one knee, as though the words themselves had weight enough to drive him down. The silence that followed became legend. His legion faltered, caught between awe and confusion. Bolters fell quiet, chain swords stilled. Thousands of warriors stood unmoving, their discipline broken not by gunfire but by the absence of command. In that pause, the world itself seemed to hold its breath. The Primarch remained kneeling, head bowed, gauntlet hands braced against the earth, as if bracing himself against something heavier than any foe. And then it ended. He rose, no word spoken, no explanation given. The campaign continued, the world subdued, the Imperium expanded. Yet those who had seen it could not forget. They whispered of the moment when their gene-father bent, when a single phrase bent the will of one bred never to break. The words themselves vanished, erased from records, excised from memory. Only the silence remained, a silence that stretched across generations like an echo. Some scholars insist it was a lie, a fabrication by heretics who sought to diminish the aura of perfection surrounding the Primarchs. Others argue that the erasure itself proves its truth, that if it were meaningless, it would not have been buried so deeply. The Ordo Redactus has purged hundreds for merely repeating rumors of the phrase, and still the story persists. It cannot be killed, because it does not need words to survive. It survives in silence, in the space where certainty once stood. Among the legions, those who remember pass the tale in fragments, not openly, never in full. A nod between veterans, a muttered phrase left incomplete, a prayer that ends too abruptly. The implication lingers. If one Primarch could be halted, even for a breath, then perhaps their perfection was not absolute. Perhaps even the sons of the Emperor could hear something greater than their father's will. What could have been said? That is the question that corrodes. Some claim it was a truth too simple to ignore, a reminder of something the Emperor himself had buried. Others whisper, it was the name of something older than Terra, older than mankind. A few dare to believe it was nothing but a mirror, a phrase that forced the Primarch to see himself not as a son, not as a god of war, but as a man. The ambiguity is the wound. Not knowing is worse than any certainty. Kael Varn, far away in Hive Nexus, would never hear of this story, but its echo stretched even to the Manufactoria. In sermons broadcast through Vox grills, the pauses between words seemed heavier. In ration lines, the silence of those waiting began to carry its own meaning. The silence taught them something the words could not, that what is left unspoken can shape belief more than any liturgy. The forbidden archives keep the tale buried, yet every custodian who guards them knows the weight of what lies within. To kneel is to admit something greater. If a Primarch kneeled even once, then the hierarchy of divinity falters. If a Primarch could be made still, then the certainty of the Imperium itself trembles. That is why the story must never be told. That is why it is whispered endlessly. Centuries have not dulled it. The silence has bent across time, carried from world to world in rumor and half-remembered fragments. Each retelling strips it further of detail, until all that remains is the image. A warrior bred for perfection, brought to his knees by words no one will speak. The image alone is enough to haunt. It is enough to remind the faithful that silence itself can be more terrifying than heresy. The archives will never release the phrase. It will never be spoken again. But its absence is louder than any proclamation. The Imperium thrives on words, decrees, and litanies. But here is a truth preserved not by repetition, but by refusal. A phrase that exists only in the space it left behind. A silence so vast that even across millennia, it still bends those who hear of it. And so the story endures. A whisper without sound. A curse without language. A truth without words. The Primarch's name is hidden. The phrase obliterated. The source erased. Yet still, across the endless dark of the galaxy, men remember the moment one of the Emperor's sons kneeled. They remember not the voice, not the words, but the stillness that followed, the stillness that endures. Beneath the Imperial Palace, there are corridors few dare to name. Not the ceremonial halls, where banners of conquest hang, nor the echoing chambers where petitions rise like incense, but the buried strata of dust and forgotten data, here, beneath the foundation stones of Terra itself. Vaults are stacked upon vault-sealed chambers, whose locks bear the sigils of silence rather than faith. In these places, the light of the Astronomicon does not reach. Here the Emperor is not proclaimed. He is only remembered, and memory itself is dangerous. It was within one of these forbidden hollows that the Ordo Redactus sent their team. 6 in number, sworn to erase as much as they uncovered. Their purpose was not to preserve truth, but to cauterize it. They moved through corridors lined with sealed cogitators, machines that had not stirred since the Unification Wars. Dust fell in rivulets from the ceiling, coating their robes and lenses. Their footsteps echoed too loudly, as if the walls themselves resisted their intrusion. And then they found it. A data slate, corroded but not dead, flickering with a light that should not have endured. The slate bore only one phrase, not written once, but endlessly, stuttering across the screen, as though trapped in a cycle older than the palace above. He was not wrong. 3 words, repeated until the screen itself seemed etched with them. The glow of the letters burrowing into the eyes of those who read it. The words pulsed faintly, as though alive, as though waiting to be believed. At first, the team assumed corruption. Dataret, a fragment of text caught in a loop, a meaningless echo. But as they dug deeper, connecting the slate to their cogitator banks, they unearthed fragments of construction logs files tied to the foundations of the Golden Throne itself. Much was corrupted beyond repair, but enough survived to form a shape, jagged and indistinct, but undeniable. 2 names were absent, not struck through, not erased by accident, but deliberately severed. 2 sons, not lost, not slain, but forgotten. The Purge Captain Malthois Kryn stared at the fragments for too long. His oaths pressed against his skull like chains, urging him to destroy what he saw, to burn the slate and salt the memory. Yet the words burned brighter. He was not wrong. They carried a weight deeper than treachery. Not failure, not rebellion, but vision, as if the forgotten had not strayed, but instead had seen something the Emperor could not afford to acknowledge. The team argued in hushed tones, as the machines wheezed and sparked. Some urged immediate purge, to destroy both slate and logs before the weight of doubt poisoned them further. Others whispered that to erase without understanding was itself betrayal. If the Emperor had chosen to forget his own sons, then what did loyalty mean? Was obedience to truth, or to silence? Kryn listened, torn between his vows and the ache in his chest. He remembered his youth. The sermons drilled into him, that the Emperor had forged his sons as perfect reflections, that only weakness and treachery explained their fall. Yet here, beneath the palace, was the suggestion of something else entirely. That two suns were not erased for failing, but for seeing, that their vision itself was intolerable. The flicker of the slate filled the chamber like a heartbeat. He was not wrong. He was not wrong. The words blurred into rhythm, and in that rhythm the purge team began to falter. They saw shapes in the flicker, two figures standing apart from their brothers, not in rebellion, but in clarity. Their eyes filled with something beyond war, beyond conquest. The Emperor's shadow falling across them, not his father, but his jailer. The vision slipped between the cracks of imagination and record, leaving only the ache of its implication. One of the scribes fell to his knees, clutching his head, muttering the phrase like prayer. Another drew his sidearm, pressing it to the slate as though execution could silence it. But the weapon shook in his hands, and he could not fire. To destroy it felt like denying breath. To leave it felt like treason. They were caught between silence and heresy, with no path untainted. Kryn finally spoke, his voice ragged. He ordered the team to seal the chamber, to record nothing, to erase nothing yet. "We will return to this," he said, but he knew they would not. The memory of the slate had already infected them, each syllable etched into their minds like brands. They could no longer forget. That was the true heresy, not the phrase itself, but the impossibility of silence once it had been read. They abandoned the chamber in silence. No reports were filed. No flames consumed the evidence. But as they returned to the upper levels, each step heavier than the last, they carried the weight of the words within them. Their loyalty no longer pointed in a single direction. It fractured, caught between the Emperor, who demanded obedience, and the truth that whispered through the slate. For Kryn, sleep never came again. In the stillness of his quarters, he heard the phrase, in the hiss of his respirator, in the hum of the palace walls. He began to wonder if loyalty was truly obedience, or if loyalty demanded doubt. If the Emperor himself had chosen to forget, then perhaps forgetting was the highest form of faith. Or perhaps it was the gravest betrayal of all. The Ordo Redactus speaks rarely of this purge team. Their names vanish from rosters, their service records erased, yet among those who guard the forbidden archives, a rumor persists that the team was not purged for failure, but for memory, that the phrase itself had marked them, binding them to a truth they could not unlearn. And so they were silenced, not to erase heresy, but to bury regret. Beneath the palace, the slate still flickers. The words still repeat. He was not wrong. The chamber remains sealed, its locks layered with sigils of denial, its existence unacknowledged. But the hum of the palace is restless there, as if the foundation itself remembers what the Emperor chose to forget. And those who pass above never know that beneath their steps lies a truth heavier than any throne. The Oxy sings of conquest, of faith, of unbroken loyalty, yet buried beneath it all, in the silence of corrupted logs and forgotten suns, lingers a phrase that cannot die. He was not wrong. 3 words, and the echo of a choice that bends even the Emperor's shadow. The custodians are not known for memory. They are known for vigilance, for the unbroken gaze that has never left the Emperor's throne. Yet among their number are whispers that even vigilance can fail, not through weakness, but through choice. It is said that once, in the shrouded reaches near the halo stars, the 10,000 fought beside a chapter whose name has since been erased. No banners survive, no roll of honor acknowledges them. What remains are fragments, blurred picked captures locked in archives so restricted that even the Ordo Malleus cannot petition to see them. Images of armor not red, not black, not gilded, but inscribed, etched with symbols older than High Gothic, older even than the tribal tongues of Terra. Lines and curves that resemble neither scripture nor sorcery, yet pulse with the weight of an oath. The battle itself is forgotten. No record lists the enemy, no hymn recalls the victory or loss. Only the presence of the custodes is certain, and the evidence of their silence is heavier than any account. For if the Emperor's own guardians marched beside a chapter, and later buried every trace of it, then the truth must have been unbearable. The Pict captures are indistinct, worn by time, corrupted by age, yet what they reveal is enough to disturb. Figures in Mark 7 plate, their pauldrons unmarked by imperial sigils, but scarred with lines that shimmer faintly in the grain of the image. The lines curve into patterns like rivers, like veins, as if the armor itself was alive with meaning. They are not runes of chaos, not blasphemous stars or sigils of demons. They are something else, something that unsettles precisely because it is not named. Witness accounts are rarer still, found only in half-burned journals and suppressed Vox recordings. One such fragment speaks of custodians standing shoulder to shoulder with these warriors, their aura might gleaming beside the unknown sigils. The voice on the recording falters, then mutters. They swore not in Gothic, not in oath script, but in sound, a rhythm, a pulse, words without tongue. The transmission ends abruptly, cut off before explanation can begin. What does it mean to fight beside those whose loyalty is carved in a language no lexicon can decipher? The Imperium survives on words, edicts, decrees, litanies of faith. To serve is to speak the correct phrases, to repeat the right prayers until they become marrow. But this chapter did not swear in words. They swore in silence, in symbols etched upon themselves, in gestures that no priest could translate. Their oaths bypassed speech, reaching toward something more primal. Not heresy, but a fracture deeper than doctrine, loyalty to a truth older than the Imperium itself. The custodians are said to embody perfection, their loyalty in, yet even they are not free of choice. To stand beside these inscribed warriors was a choice, and to erase them afterward was another. Did the 10,000 believe those oaths were true, only to bury them when truth proved too vast for the Imperium to contain? Or did they stand silent, complicit in a loyalty that was never meant to be spoken aloud? Cale Varney, far below on Hive Nexus, would never know of this. But the echo reached even his kind, twisted into rumor. Workers whispered of golden warriors fighting beside shadows, of sigils that glowed in silence. They repeated fragments without meaning, believing them to be lost prayers. The language spread not as instruction, but as infection. Symbols drawn idly into ash, scratched into bunk walls, marked on tools. No one knew what they meant, yet all felt they meant something. In the archives of Terra, one blurred image lingers longer than the rest. A custodian stands with his guardian's spear lowered, helm crested with the eagle of Terra. Yet, beside him, walks a warrior whose armor is black as void, his chest carved with spirals that resemble a sun being swallowed. The two march as equals, not as master and supplicant. The image is cropped, damaged, yet the stance of both men is clear. They are brothers. Such an image is heresy to preserve, yet it endures in shadow. Loyalty fractured that day, not into rebellion, but into something subtler. It was not the defiance of chaos, not the lure of Xenos, not treachery in its common form. It was the recognition of another bond older, wordless, deeper than liturgy. To the Imperium, that bond was intolerable. For what is loyalty if it cannot be spoken, measured, and recorded? If it exists in silence, it cannot be controlled. And so silence became their sentence. The chapter's name erased, their victories struck out, their banners burned. Only the symbols remain, etched into fragments of armor now sealed away, too dangerous to destroy, too blasphemous to display. Some say those symbols were not human at all, but remnants of a language carried from the dawn of the galaxy, a script not written by men, nor Xenos, but by the fabric of reality itself, a myth, a pattern glimpsed in the warp, carved into flesh and steel by those who refused to believe loyalty could be confined to one tongue. If that is true, then the custodians themselves once walked beside warriors who swore by the cosmos, not by the Emperor. The Ordo Redactus insists such tales are fabrications, that the picked captures are forgeries, that the whispers are distortions of older truths, and yet, the effort to bury them betrays the effort to preserve them. Silence that absolute is not denial, it is fear. If loyalty can fracture not into treason, but into something older, then every oath in the Imperium, Tremble, start in the dark corners of the galaxy. There are still reports, never confirmed, always dismissed, of warriors clad in black, their armor carved with lines no scholar can read. They appear on battlefields only to vanish, fighting beside neither foe nor ally, their oaths spoken only in gesture and silence. They do not take planets. They do not raise banners. They pass through warlike echoes, carving their meaning into memory and then fading. To see them is to question, and in the Imperium, to question is the gravest heresy of all. Perhaps that is why the custodians do not speak of them. Perhaps that is why the 10,000 bury their silence in duty. For once, long ago, they fought beside warriors who swore loyalty not in the Emperor's name, but in the name of something no tongue could capture. Not betrayal, not faithlessness, but a language older than war. And if those oaths still echo in the dark, carved into the armor of warriors no record will name, then the silence of the custodians is not only memory, it is confession. The banners rose high over the desolate plains, their cloths stiff with dust, their poles driven into soil that had not known the way to footsteps for millennia. The chapter sang hymns of triumph, their voices echoing against mountains of black stone, their war gear gleaming with the sheen of victory. The tomb world was theirs. Every vault shattered, every metallic form reduced to ruin, every echo of ancient silence silenced again. The Necron threat had been purged. So they believed. The campaign had been merciless. Vault after vault disgorged endless ranks of deathless warriors, their eyes burning with inhuman memory. The chapter had fought through corridors of living metal, against weapons that turned flesh to ash and armor to slag. They had endured attrition that would have annihilated a lesser host. Their brothers falling in heaps of shattered ceramite, their banners blackened by Gauss fire. Yet still, they pressed forward, guided by the iron will of their chapter master. Until the final vault collapsed, and no more enemies stirred. When the last Necron body was ground beneath their boots, a cheer rose that shook the cavern ceilings. They declared the planet secure. They declared the Imperium victorious. They declared themselves eternal, for they had triumphed where so many others had faltered. The chapter master struck his blade into the earth and proclaimed the tomb world theirs by right of conquest. The Vox channels blazed with hymns of praise. Triumph was theirs, unshakable and absolute. And yet, when the time came to depart, the first unease began to whisper. The fleet did not answer. Vox signals sent into orbit returned in perfect clarity, but always the same reply, looping endlessly, acknowledged, preparing extraction. No ships descended, no engines thundered in the sky. The words repeated without error, without delay, until they no longer sounded like voices, but like the echo of a machine stuck in cycle. The chapter master ordered patience. Repairs would take time. Extraction would come. The warriors obeyed, erecting fortifications upon the surface, converting the tombs into bastions of the Imperium. But as days stretched into weeks, and weeks into months, the stars themselves began to shift. Astropaths reached outward, seeking the Astronomicon, only to find the constellations unmoored. Star maps twisted upon themselves, coordinates refusing to align. Every attempt to plot a course home ended in fracture, as though the galaxy itself had bent around them. Still, the chapter clung to victory. They patrolled their conquered world, raising shrines where the enemy had fallen, lighting censers in the ruins of Necron halls. They carried their triumph like armor, unwilling to let it corrode. But the silence deepened. Voxcasters fell mute, their only sound the endless loop of preparing extraction. It was not static. It was not failure. It was perfect, unchanging, eternal. Some began to wonder if the Necrons had ever truly been destroyed. The bodies they had ground to dust left no trace of soul, no permanence of death. The tombs remained hollow, but their silence felt too absolute, as if waiting. Brothers spoke of echoes in the dark, of metallic footfalls that ceased when approached. Others dreamed of the same battle, fought again and again. Their own deaths, repeating in perfect symmetry. The chapter master forbade such talk. "We are victorious," he said. "Victory is eternal." His words became the new liturgy, repeated across vox channels, carved into stone, etched into armor. And yet, each repetition rang hollower, each proclamation thinner, for though they had triumphed, no brother set foot beyond the tomb world again. Years passed. Generations of mortals on the world below lived and died, their lives tethered to the guardians who never left. The chapter did not age as mortals did, but even they felt the stagnation. They drilled endlessly, fighting training exercises against each other, reenacting the great campaign again and again. Each drill blurred into memory until no one could recall which battles had been real and which invented. They told themselves it did not matter. Victory was all that endured, yet unease festered. Chaplains spoke louder, their sermons frantic, their prayers more desperate than reverent. "Victory is permanence," they declared. "Permanence is proof." But the warriors saw the truth in their silence. Their victory had not freed them. It had chained them. The price of triumph was to remain. To remain was to forget time, and in forgetting time, they began to forget themselves. Some brothers swore they had already left, that they had boarded ships, broken orbit, and returned home. Their memories insisted upon it. Yet when they stood upon the battlements and looked to the sky, the looping vox signal still whispered, preparing extraction. They questioned their own minds. Had they left? Had they returned? Were they still fighting? Memory fractured, splintered, reassembled itself in patterns that no longer fit. The planet became a prison not of walls, but of certainty. They had one, and therefore they could not leave. To leave would be to deny the permanence of victory. To remain was to honor it, even if it meant eternity. The chapter split in spirit, though not in flesh. Some embraced the permanence, carving the word victory into their armor until it gleamed brighter than their heraldry. Others drifted into silence, fighting battles only in their minds, their voices falling mute. The Necron tombs stirred again, not with warriors, but with echoes. Vault doors shifted without hands. Corridors reformed where none should exist. The warriors patrolled them as if foes still lurked, but no enemies came. Only the architecture moved, rearranging itself like a body shifting in restless sleep. It became clear then that the tomb world itself had not been defeated. Their triumph had been the final trigger. By conquering it, they had bound themselves to it. The realization struck slowly, like rust-corroding armor. They had not secured freedom. They had secured permanence. They were as eternal as the tomb itself. Their greatest victory had not ended the war. It had ended time. Now when their chaplains chant, their voices tremble. When their banners wave, the cloth is threadbare. They still declare themselves victorious, but victory has become indistinguishable from exile. They fight drills not to prepare, but to remember what it means to fight. They march patrols not to guard, but to believe they are still needed. And when they kneel in prayer, they pray not for deliverance, but for meaning within the silence. No ship ever comes. The stars remain warped, the vox loop endless. The chapter has become a monument, living statues bound to a tomb world they once thought conquered. They do not die in battle. They do not return in glory. They endure, and in that endurance lies their curse. For the Imperium will never know their triumph, nor their prison. Victory is theirs, but only as permanence, and permanence is indistinguishable from oblivion. The battlefield was silent to the eye. No banners, no movement, no flare of bolter fire or the sweep of chainswords. The ground was broken earth, pitted and scarred by blasts long spent. Armor lay rusted in the soil, bones half buried where storms had scoured them clean. By every measure of history, the war here was over. The campaign closed, the conflict decided, the dead left nameless beneath the weight of dust. Yet, in the air, the war continued. It persisted in signals, in orders, in voices that had no bodies to obey them. Across the frequencies, Vox traffic still bled through static. At first it seemed like distortion, the natural afterbirth of battle where countless signals collide and collapse. But as the years stretched, the traffic did not fade. It grew clearer. Squads called out identity signs with crisp precision, coordinates relayed, orders repeated, requests for ammunition, reinforcements, extraction all transmitted in the sharp rhythm of soldiers who had not faltered, not died, not forgotten their duty. Each message ran as though the war were still raging, as though no time had passed. Imperial surveyors who passed too close swore they could hear it bleeding into their own channels. The ghostly overlay of squads reporting in, commanders barking orders. The voices bore no static garble. They were strong, insistent, alive. And yet, when Auspex sweeps scoured the battlefield, they found no heat signatures, no movement, no living forms, only the endless back and forth of an army long dead, fighting a war without end. The Ordo Xenos sent investigators once, believing it to be some Necron ploy, an echo machine meant to lure the Imperium into false campaigns. The investigators arrived with full battalions, tracing the signals to their source. They found platoons marching in formation figures made of nothing, their outlines woven from dust and static. They moved with perfect rhythm, bolters raised, formation unbroken. Their patrols circled trenches, crossed ridges, vanished into smoke that no longer burned. The battalions fired upon them, but their rounds struck only air. The patrols did not falter, did not break. They simply marched on, obeying orders that had been given centuries ago. The Vox channels confirmed it. Calcines answered each other. Commanders dispatched reinforcements to positions that no longer existed. A gun emplacement long since collapsed still reported ammunition shortages. A squad listed as annihilated in official records still requested Medicae extraction. And always, the responses came timely precise. As if the dead themselves refused to let the war close. The investigators burned the field, purged the ruins with promethium and holy litanies. Still, the signals bled through, unbroken. The firestorms raged, and over the roar of flame, the voices continued to report. Squad Primus, holding line, coordinates secured, requesting resupply. The commander's replies came without hesitation, acknowledged. Hold position, reinforcements, en route. Reinforcements that never came, orders that no one gave, yet still obeyed. Years passed. The Imperium marked the site as quarantined, sealing it beneath prohibition. Yet the signals spread, carried like infection through the warp, slipping into channels, light years away. Fleets on distant patrol reported ghost commands, orders issued in the tone of commanders long dead. Entire companies halted maneuvers to obey instructions from voices they could not trace. Battles were lost to confusion, supply lines twisted into ruin, because soldiers obeyed commands that no officer had given. The Adeptus Mechanicus attempted to catalog the phenomenon, naming it Vox Nihil, the choir of nothing. They spoke of signal residue, of binary ghosts that refused to dissipate. But their equations faltered, their data corrupted by echoes that rewrote themselves. Vox Nihil was not static. It was persistence. It was war itself, refusing silence. On the battlefield, the patrols never ceased. Through storms, through years of erosion, through the shifting of the very earth beneath them, they moved in endless rhythm, each step perfect, each formation tight, each order obeyed. When night fell, they did not sleep. When dawn came, they did not falter. Their bolters never fired, but their grips never loosened. Their march was the war. The war was the march. Some who listened too long began to hear more than orders. Beneath the clipped tones of sergeants and the firm commands of captains, there were pleas woven into repetition, fragments of words not meant for open channels. Still here, still waiting. We held the line. Do not forget us. The voices bled emotion through discipline, sorrow through protocol, and those who heard wept, for they realized these were not just echoes of orders. They were echoes of memory. Cale Varn, in his hive of ash, would never hear them. Yet men like him, across the Imperium, spoke of dreams where voices called through static, commanding them to rise, to march, to hold. Even in sleep, the choir of nothing spread, turning silence into rhythm, war into prayer. The Imperium does not return to the battlefield. It is listed as purged, abandoned, irrelevant. Yet still, the orders roll across the airwaves, binding nothing to nothing. 1,000 squads obeying 1,000 commands, all precise, all endless, all void. Vox Nihil does not fade, it endures, and in its endurance, it defies death itself. There are those who whisper that one day, when the galaxy burns its last, and all banners fall, the final armies to march will not be of flesh or sound. They will be the echoes, the patrols of Vox Nihil, moving through dust and ruin, answering orders that no longer exist. The Imperium will be gone, the stars cold, the throne silent, but still, the voices will call. Still, the squads will move. War will continue, not in blood, but in signal, not in victory, but in rhythm. The battlefield is silent to the eye. To the ear, it is eternal. The first scream was not of defeat, but of survival. When the enemy's strike cut through the chapter's apothecarian, it did not simply take lives. It severed the marrow of their continuity. Gene seed lost, knowledge immolated, healers torn apart before their hands could preserve even a fraction. For most chapters, apothecaries are the thread binding past to future. Surgeons and shepherds who ensure each death births another. For these warriors, the thread was cut. What remained unraveled. At first they sought replacements. They dispatched signals into the void, begging aid, requesting the presence of healers from kin legions. But silence answered. Whether the Imperium denied them, or the warp devoured their pleas, no help came. When their wounded fell, there were no hands skilled enough to tend the gene seed. Their losses bled not only into earth, but into nothing. Each death was final, unredeemable, a fracture in their line. Yet the warriors endured. They bound wounds with cloth stripped from banners. They stitched flesh with wire. They poured promethium over gashes to cauterize what could not be mended. The smell of charred muscle became incense, the hiss of burning wounds a litany. Their chaplains declared pain was proof that the Emperor himself bled eternally for mankind, and so too would his sons. The warriors nodded, faces pale beneath helmets, blood seeping through their armor seams. Their screams echoed across the battlefield, but the screams became battle cries. In time, they ceased to distinguish between the two. A charge was not a maneuver, but a howl of agony. Their bolters thundered, not in rhythm with tactics, but in sync with the pulse of their wounds. Blood splattered not only from enemies, but from themselves, staining ground and sky alike. They wrapped themselves in cloth darkened with old stains, never replaced, never cleaned, proof that their suffering had no end. Other chapters recoiled at their presence. To fight beside them was to hear agony unbroken. To see brothers split open, yet charging faster, fiercer, as though injury itself was fuel, where other space marines sought to endure wounds until healed. These warriors tore their injuries wider, making them banners of devotion. A rent in the flesh was a proclamation, a shattered limb, a hymn. Their enemies faltered before them. Orcs, who prized the roar of battle, hesitated at screams that did not stop even when their foes should have fallen. Tyranids, relentless in hunger, found themselves confused by prey that bled willingly, offering pain as though it were sustenance. Even Necrons, whose logic was iron and whose memory was perfect, slowed in their advance, as if they too struggled to categorize warriors who treated suffering as doctrine. It was said that their chapter master never removed his helm, for beneath it his jaw was locked in a permanent scream. He led not with words, but with sound, the howl of unbroken pain that surged across Vox channels and drove his warriors into frenzy. To hear it was to be reminded that pain was permanence, and permanence was proof. Their librarians, stripped of healer's counsel, twisted agony into psychic force. They drew power not from calm focus, but from ruptured flesh, each psychic bolt sharpened by the sensation of blood flowing from their veins. They claimed that in suffering they touched something closer to the Emperor than any hymn could reach. Their minds became scars, their powers raw edges that tore not only at the foe, but at reality itself. Centuries passed. The chapter never healed. Their wounds became their heraldry, their screams, their liturgy. They carried the scent of iron wherever they went, a stench that lingered in every war zone after their departure. Planets liberated by their hand remembered them not as saviors, but as phantoms of agony, spirits who brought freedom in a tide of screams. Children imitated their cries in alleyways, not out of mockery, but because those cries had become the sound of survival. The High Lords debated whether to censure them, to disband what many saw as aberration, but disbanding would have required healing, and healing was impossible. To erase them was to acknowledge that their pain had meaning. And so the Imperium did what it always does, with what it cannot name. It turned away. The chapter fought on, nameless in records, faceless in banners, yet unavoidable on the field. Some whisper that they no longer remove their armor, that beneath ceramite and adamantine there is only rot, wounds so deep that to reveal them would be to reveal death itself. But still they march, still they bleed, still they scream. Pain has become their weapon, their shield, their creed. Or others seek to end suffering. They enshrine it, proving with each broken charge that they are eternal, precisely because they are never whole. Kael'varn, lost in his hive of ash, would never see them, yet even he, in dreams, felt their echoes. The hiss of respirators mirrored their cries. The drip of blood from rusted pipes matched their rhythm. Across the Imperium, wherever silence stretched too far, the memory of their screams returned, reminding men that pain endures where all else fails. The chapter remains unrecorded, their names struck from rolls, their victories claimed by others, but their presence cannot be erased. Wherever war rages, some swear they hear it. The unending wail of warriors who never healed, never rested, never ceased. To the enemy, it is terror. To the Imperium, it is shame. To the chapter itself, it is truth. Pain as permanence, pain as proof. And when the galaxy itself crumbles into final ruin, it will not be hymns or banners that echo last. It will be screams, raw and unending, carried by those who never healed. They were first seen at the edge of a war that was already lost. The Astra Militarum had been routed, their banners broken, their Vox signals reduced to static. The orcs surged across the fields, crude engines roaring, their laughter echoing like drums. Yet, in the midst of that collapse, figures emerged from the smoke. Their armor was not marked by heraldry. Their banners bore no sigils. Their oaths were unknown. They fought with the precision and ferocity of the Adeptus Astartes, but when the guard survivors tried to name them, no name came, only silence. The soldiers swore they saw the strangers charge into the orc lines with perfect formation, their bolters roaring, chainswords singing. They cut through mobs, as though guided by centuries of training. But when one of them fell, struck down by a cleaver the size of a man, his body did not crash to the ground. It dissolved. The ceramite broke apart into dust, the flesh unmade, leaving only a weapon on the soil. A bolter, still warm, but without a hand to hold it. Others fell, and the same fate followed. Armor dissolved into nothing, eyes fading like embers, until only war gear remained soulless, abandoned. No corpse to burn, no gene seed to recover, only fragments, stripped of identity. When the battle ended, the survivors gathered the weapons, hoping to return them to the Mechanicus, but the weapons corroded within days, rust consuming them as if they had aged 1,000 years in hours. The Imperium tried to catalog these warriors, to affix a name, a lineage, a record. Nothing held. No pict capture remained clear. No Vox recording lasted more than a cycle before distortion devoured it. Administratum clerks wrote reports that turned blank the next day, ink fading into pale lines across parchment. The Ordo Hereticus declared it anomaly. The Ordo Malleus muttered of warp interference, but no explanation survived. The only thing certain was their presence, and the certainty was always fleeting. They appeared again on other battlefields, sometimes beside loyalists, sometimes between enemy lines, sometimes in wars the Imperium itself did not acknowledge. Their numbers were never consistent, 5 on one world, 50 on another. They fought without heraldry, without cry, their silence, their only identity. Their eyes burned with age that did not belong to any son of the Emperor. To look into them was to see not defiance, nor faith, but memory stretched beyond reason. Ancient eyes and bodies that dissolved before they could be named. Chaplains tried to confront them, shouting litanies, demanding oaths. The strangers gave no reply. They fought until struck down, and when they fell, they left nothing but trace. Chaplains reported voices in their heads as the strangers died, not words, but impressions, like echoes of forgotten battles, memories that had no owner. Some swore they felt entire wars pressed into their skulls, campaigns that were never recorded, victories that belonged to no legion, memory without record, truth without history. The custodians refused to speak of them. When asked, they turned their gaze away, as if acknowledging would grant permanence. But silence itself is confession. For if these warriors are not of the Emperor's making, why does the Imperium treat them not as heretics, but as absences? To censure, to condemn, would require record, and record is impossible. Kael Varn, buried in ash, far from these battlefields, would never see them. Yet their echo reached even him, as if the silence of their deaths was not confined to the stars. Workers in the Hive muttered of shadows who fought wars long before Terra's unity, of soldiers who marched in silence and left nothing behind. They scratched symbols of absent banners into the walls, not knowing why, only knowing they had to remember what could not be remembered in the final descent of their story. One truth emerged: death was not their end. Death was erasure. The galaxy itself refused to hold them. They fought like space marines, bore weapons like space marines, died like space marines, but nothing tied them to the Emperor. No oath, no creed, no gene seed. Their existence was fracture, an unhealed wound in history, a reminder that not all stories can be bound by record. The Mechanicus sought to harness what little could be seized. Weapons gathered from their deaths were taken into vaults, sealed and sanctified. Yet the weapons corroded faster than study allowed. Fragments crumbled, inscriptions faded. Even data records of their measurements erased themselves line by line. To study them was to lose them. To hold them was to watch them dissolve. Some whispered they were the remnants of the lost legions, erased so thoroughly that even death could not hold them. Others claimed they were shadows birthed from the warp, memory given flesh for moments before dissolving back into silence. Still others said they were proof of wars too vast to name, echoes of campaigns so ancient that the Imperium itself had forgotten. No theory endured. The moment they were spoken, the words seemed to slip away, yet the strangers endured in their own way. They appeared, they fought, they dissolved, each time the same. They were warriors without memory, victories without record, weapons without wielders. They were reminders that war itself is not eternal because it is remembered, but because it cannot be forgotten. They existed in the fracture between those truths. On one nameless world, a lone guardsman survived a battle fought entirely between such strangers and an enemy he could not name. He wrote of it in blood on stone, the only medium that did not erase itself. His words remain, though the letters fade. They fought, they fell, and the world forgot them even as I carved this. The guardsman himself dissolved the following night, his bunk empty, his uniform collapsed into dust. What remains when memory fails? Not silence. Silence implies absence. What remains is fracture, edges too sharp to forget, too indistinct to hold. The Imperium cannot record them, because there is nothing to record. No names, no banners, no gene seed, only glimpses of eyes that hold the weight of ages, and weapons that corrode, as though ashamed to endure. And yet, in the deepest vaults, in the forbidden places where archivists walk with trembling hands, there are always fragments, smudged picts, half-erased entries, marks and margins, as though the galaxy itself tries, in vain, to remember, as though even erasure cannot close the wound. This chapter does not end. It cannot, for these warriors are not endings, but ruptures. They are proof that some stories were never meant to close. They dissolve, but their fracture endures.